Hey, welcome back to the Down the Rabbit Hole podcast. I'm your host, Rob Wall. So today's episode will be on spirituality, and I have my buddy Tyler here.
Hello.
So, to get this party started, I'm going to ask you a deep question, but one that is not so easy to answer, I don't think. And so, what is spirituality to you?
Sure. What is spirituality? So I guess obviously there's, religion, but spirituality can exist independent of religion. I guess I've heard and read it described in a lot of different ways. So it's kind of it can be this otherworldly, I've heard it called the fourth dimension. Actually, that's how Bill Wilson described it in the big book, Fourth Dimension of Existence. But I guess in some ways there is, a deep truth to spirituality, things that are inherently true. And so it's not always this, abstract or other place or, spirituality isn't a destination either. You can find a spiritual experience within yourself here and now. And, as far as mindfulness, it's kind of being in the present moment, being in reality. So yeah, a lot of spiritual concepts are abstract, but can actually bring us closer in tune with truth and reality at the same time.
I actually heard something earlier today about Stoicism.
Okay.
And how in Stoicism they worship the light within yourself, right?
Sure.
And when I heard this concept, the person that was explaining it was actually hating on it, because what they were saying is it kind of can lead to, I guess, worshiping yourself, basically. So I don't know if you've ever fallen into the trap of spiritual ego, where it's you start to practice some spirituality, you start to get a new vantage point on life, and you start to your eyes start to become open, but then very quickly you start to feel like you know better.
Yeah, it's kind of like your ego intrudes into your spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I guess specifically I've experienced that a little bit in addiction recovery, in a 12-step program, which is how I was initially introduced to spirituality. I guess in that realm specifically for me, it became after a certain point, because you can't really intellectualize spirituality. I mean, a lot of concepts of it are or maybe you can understand it intellectually, but it's not the same as fully experiencing it or being it,
Yeah.
being or living it.
But that's the thing. I agree with you on that point. But the thing is, in the recovery aspect, at least, you sort of have to, at a certain level, be able to intellectualize it a little bit to be able to explain it.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because you're dealing with a lot of agnostic people that are on the fence about this kind of stuff, so you have to speak to them about it in their language, and I think that's what we're at pains to do.
Right. Yeah, and something unfortunately I've seen within that realm, people gain spiritual knowledge, especially in within the world of addiction recovery and 12-step programs, and sometimes it can seem like people almost hold that over the newcomer's head a little bit, of I possess this knowledge, I know these things, hopefully with a willingness to teach. To teach it. I mean, a lot of spiritual teachers, one of the things they teach is always question the teacher, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's definitely something I try to avoid.
Well, going back to the Stoicism thing, when this guy was hating on it, I understood what he meant completely, but I feel like that's only part of the picture, because it's okay, let's say this idea of the inner light, is a fundamental truth, and I'm not saying that it is, but let's say it is. So if there's a God within you, right, we'll call it a manifestation of God in the form of spirit or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
if that's a thing, it's not unique to the individual. I mean, it would be within everybody. You know what I mean? So it's like, yeah, if you're worshiping the light within yourself, like it could come across as worshiping yourself, I guess, unless you were fully aware that that light was within everybody. Because I've heard spiritual concepts before that say like you must love others for the God within them above all else, right? And so I don't necessarily think it's like a dead end road is kind of what I'm getting at with all that. But obviously, being from a 12-step fellowship, you know, we're kind of, that's just sort of drilled into our head, you know, is to kind of be open-minded to other people's spiritual beliefs. And you know, I've seen all sorts of beliefs, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of speaks to like interconnectedness, which I think is a huge component of spirituality. And even, I mean, you can experience that synthetically if you ingest LSD. I mean, you'll
Yeah.
you know, the significance of all things. You know, I mean, we talk about gratitude, appreciating things, and also feeling connected to the world around us, to people around us, and ourselves, and God, the universe, and all that stuff. So if something good exists outside of me, it's perfectly reasonable to expect part of that to be within myself also.
Yeah. Well, not for nothing too. Like, I think that spirituality is a way in which we can mold our perception of the world too. And so I feel like you can't have like a good conversation about perception without talking about hallucinogenic drugs, at least at one point, you know, not that I'm an advocate at this point anymore, because, you know, I've had, you couldn't believe some of the debates that I've had to have with sponsees in the past about hallucinogens, because they think they've cracked the code, and they're like, oh no, I could do this because it's for my higher power, you know. And I'm like, I think you might be off to the wrong start here, you know.
I've had those ideas once upon a time.
Yeah.
In recovery,
and they don't work, because I mean, I had a sponsee that did that at one point, and it didn't work out well for him at all. The number one question I had to ask him is like, okay, so you're doing the step work with me. You're trying to get through it, even though we're kind of stalling out a little bit, because obviously there's a step one issue here. But like, if you believe in the steps, and you believe that the steps will lead you to spirituality that works, right? But you also think that hallucinogens will make that spirituality even better and stronger. It's like, I have to ask the question of like, why does it need to be better? Why does it need to be stronger?
right?
Why isn't the same amount of spirituality that works for everybody else not good enough for you? So that's the kind of stuff that I wanted them to think about and ask them, you know, because is this coming from ego? Is this coming from a like, I need to, it's just the proportion thing, man. Right. You know, because like, I don't know about you, but like, I still have that problem of more, even with the good things in life, the healthy things in life. You know, like exercise, I can take that to an extreme. Nobody would sit here and say like exercising is bad, you know?
For sure.
But if you're doing it 7 days a week without any breaks, and you're contemplating steroids and going crazy with it, you know?
Right.
Then all of a sudden you've taken a good thing and made it bad, you know? And I've done it with AA, man. You know, I've been that guy that had no personality whatsoever outside of AA, and taking on more sponsees than I can handle, you know.
Sure. Well, yeah, you kind of mentioned like ego cropping up in that, and I definitely was in a place once upon a time of oh, my home group studies the big book better than yours, and like crap like that, which is stupid.
Just AA gangs.
Yeah. But yeah, as far as I guess for me, the whole hallucinogen thing, it's kind of like organic versus synthetic spirituality. Yeah. And not to say that there isn't, that's not valid or real. But like we've talked about Huxley before, and like Huxley wrote The Doors of Perception, focus on spiritual achievement through taking psychedelics. And then he also wrote The Perennial Philosophy, which is more about organic spirituality without drugs, and
Mm-hmm.
kind of speaking again to like interconnectedness. He like takes transcripts from religious texts from different religions of different times all over different parts of the world, and kind of dissects like common themes and spiritual concepts out of them in all these different languages from these different books. So that's cool.
Mm.
But yeah, it's just kind of like,
Well, that's the thing about Huxley too, is he didn't go down the path that like Tim Leary went down. You know what I mean? He wasn't trying to like turn it into a religion, but he did have like an experience that altered his perception. You know what I mean? But it wasn't something that he was doing constantly throughout his life.
right,
Those experiences were far and few in between.
sure.
And my favorite story about him too is he took LSD intramuscular on his deathbed, and he was tripping at the moment of his death.
Nice.
So yeah, he wanted, I guess, to expand his consciousness so he could really experience the moment of death, I guess, which is, it's interesting to me, not that it sounds appealing by any means, but it's interesting to me that somebody could be so dedicated into, you know, searching for something even to the very last moments of their life, you know. But even Tim Leary, who, you know, tried to make all that into a religion, he went on to say much later in his life, you know, the biggest mistake they made is like, once you get the message, hang up the phone. Like, in other words, like, they screwed up in the process of like thinking that it was a good idea to take these hallucinogens all the time, you know.
I'm actually not familiar with Tim Leary. Was he like a cult leader? Or?
Yeah, well, he was actually a professor of psychology at Harvard.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then he got his hands on LSD back in the late 50s, early 60s, like when it first started breaking out. Yeah, basically, I wouldn't necessarily call it a cult, but maybe it could be a cult. I don't know. Is AA a cult?
Organization.
Yeah. They were really, I think, maybe trying to start a religion, but obviously they ran into their problems because, you know, you can't take things like that all the time and expect to be rational enough to make something that works.
Yeah.
You know, practically speaking.
Well, and I think that's the biggest issue with anyone who's been addicted to substances at any time in their life, taking psychedelics for spiritual growth, like you were describing.
I'm like, what is this beeping?
Yeah, what is that?
I have no idea, man.
Yeah, so, you know, maybe for some people who don't have substance abuse issues, you know, taking LSD at a reasonable dose and a reasonable frequency to have some form of spiritual experience, like, that's cool.
Yeah. But I think I mean, I think we're both in agreement in like the organic spiritual experience is probably for the best, you know.
Yeah, well, I just think it's more genuine, it's more sustainable, because like you said, you can't live on LSD every day of your life.
Well, absolutely, but like, and like, let's look at organic spiritual experience to begin with. Like, well, actually, before I make this point, let's hear. Can you tell me about your spiritual experience? What was your first spiritual experience like?
Sure. Yeah, so I was an agnostic most of my life. My mother was she was an atheist until she became a born-again Christian, like in her 30s. And my father was raised in the Catholic Church, but wanted nothing to do with it. And had probably reverted to the point of atheism. So I didn't really have spirituality or religion growing up, for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
So I was about 22 years old when I started. You know, I had substance abuse issues as a teenager and young adult. Started my recovery journey at 22. I did come to a 12-step fellowship, which is, you know, basically a dummy's guide to have a spiritual awakening, which, you know, a side effect of that is it relieves us of alcoholism and addiction. So that was my introduction, you know, working a 12-step program. In particular, though, step 11, like improve our conscious contact, right? Or saw through prayer and meditation to do so. Like, that's really where my spiritual journey like really took off and expanded. That's when I started nerding out, reading different spiritual literature, watching videos of spiritual teachers like Eckhart Tolle, Anthony DeMello, some friends of mine, and my spiritual advisor at the time. We just like packed up my car one day and drove to upstate New York to a Buddhist monastery.
Oh wow.
So I got to do that.
That's cool.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of it for me was just letting go of myself and my ego a little bit. I started to not only watch my conduct, but the deeper I got, I started to watch my thought life, right? As someone prone to addiction and some mental health struggles, a lot of the thoughts that enter my mind aren't very friendly or helpful. So like spirituality and mindfulness kind of helped me start getting a track on that of thoughts coming in my mind and me making a choice, having the power of choice over how much I wanted to engage with said thoughts, let alone, whether I wanted to act on them or not. And that was like really liberating for me. I mean, that's going to help any human being in a human experience, but especially with some of the struggles I had going on, it was just like relieving and empowering.
Yeah.
And that's what part of it is. It is seeking, but a lot of it's like shrinking a little bit, like knocking the ego down a couple pegs and turning down the volume on the noise in the mind, and getting a little bit of peace through those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one thing that I noticed, especially in 12-step groups and stuff, I think a lot of people don't have the full idea of what ego actually is, because I think they think it's like synonymous with pride.
Right.
And
for sure.
And like pride is part of the ego for sure. Like your pride is centered in the ego, but it's definitely only one aspect of it. Matter of fact, like the complete opposite is also part of the ego too. Like
absolutely.
that
it's either I'm the best or I'm the worst.
Well, yeah, but that's the flip side of the same coin of pride. It's like, you're either going to be the best or you're going to be the best at being the worst. But ego is, I think, all encompassing. It's kind of the inner monologue, I think, is one of the best ways to put it. It's the story you're telling yourself. And so it's your entire view. It's your entire view on the world. Like, it's assigning values. It's just the story that you're telling yourself,
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of people say, it's a program of ego deflation, and I think they're spot on, right? But I think people think that means like deflating the pride and having some humility, and of course, like, that is a massive part of all of this, and without humility none of this is possible.
Sure.
But for me, deflating the ego means is like I start to not listen to the story that I'm telling myself.
Mm-hmm. Ego narrative, that's a big thing. Eckhart Tolle describes it as like the pain body, like the part of our conscious or ego that's like addicted to pain and suffering.
Oh yeah.
Like there's a part of us that actually enjoys pain and suffering.
Oh yeah, we were just talking about that at the meeting last night. I was saying that upon closer examination, I think I found that I love my suffering, or at least loved. I don't necessarily think I love it anymore, but at one point I did.
Mm-hmm.
And
when I think part of that is the ego narrative you mentioned, because it's a sense of purpose. It's a story. Yeah. In some ways, it's excuses. It's excuses
exactly.
for my conduct, my behavior.
Yeah.
Like this is the story I've written about myself. This is my trauma. These are the things I've struggled with, or the things I've gone with. So this is why I act this way, or this is why I am the way that
exactly.
I am. Not to invalidate trauma or life struggles or anything like that, but yeah, that's yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to put it dramatically, if I let go of my suffering, then maybe the world wouldn't be so meaningless anymore. And the problem is, if the world isn't meaningless, then I'm not free to just live however the hell I want.
Mm-hmm. And what would that really look like? And how would I really be if this isn't me?
Yeah.
If I let go of this story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the other thing where I identified, and I've talked about that with people before, even on here, like we identify not only with the drinking and the drugging, but we identify with the behaviors, we identify with the sickness of it all, and so when it comes time to change, that makes it extraordinarily difficult, because we're not just trying to change, which is difficult enough. What we're really trying to do is like let go of a part of us, and it's unfortunately, if you've started young and it's all you've ever done, it's probably the only part of you that you actually know. Like
Right.
you're kind of just,
or at least the most apparent part of yourself,
Yeah.
the part you're most familiar with.
yeah. And so if you have no clue who you are, and then you let go of the one part that you do know about, then you're just kind of a void, right? But that's a beautiful thing, because anybody who has some experience in spirituality, God loves a void, right? Nature and God abhor a vacuum, right? So in other words, once the void has been created, that's usually when something better rushes in.
Right, because there's too much of me inside of me,
Yeah.
so to speak.
And to bring it full circle, the whole point that I started to make when I was saying how organic spiritual experience is what we need, is because the effects produced by spiritual experience are fleeting, right? So you have a spiritual experience, right, and a new world snaps into view. You can see it in Bill's story very clearly. He did a good job at putting that into words about how the scales of pride and prejudice fell from his eyes. A new world came into view. At last I saw, I felt, I believe,
Sure.
And that's kind of how it was for me, right? So this whole world snaps into view, and it's like, holy crap, it was overwhelming, man. I literally thought I was losing my mind, and if it wasn't for the fact that I was living in a halfway house at the time, and there was a couple of guys that had some time under their belt, because I went up to them and I told them exactly what I was feeling, exactly what was going through my head, and they were like, sounds like you're having a spiritual experience, and I was like, oh. Because before that, it was just some words on a piece of paper. Like I never,
Right.
And so, it was amazing. Like I like to say, this might be a little cheesy, but I like to say I saw the world through God's eyes for a brief moment.
Sure.
Right. But I mean, within a couple of days, man, I was back to hating my boss, wanting to choke somebody. Like the same old pitfalls that I'm constantly falling into. And so it just goes to show you that that's fleeting. And the beauty of a 12-step program is it's literally designed to put you on a collision course with one experience after the other. And sometimes you have a dry period, where you're like, you haven't had one of those vital spiritual experiences that rejuvenate your entire recovery, your entire perspective on life. You haven't had one for a while. This is where sponsorship comes in to save the day, because then you start working with the new guy, and next thing you know, you're seeing it happen in their life, and these start to have these vital spiritual experiences, and so you're sort of vicariously living through them, and that literally can carry you through those dry spells until bam, one day you have one of your own.
Sure.
And the most ironic thing I think about the whole thing is the vital spiritual experience that you need to rejuvenate your recovery during those dry spells is oftentimes hiding behind the suggestion that you're not taking. Right?
Sure.
Chris spoke the other day. He, his tape was really good, and one of the things he said that like caught me off guard. I was like, damn. He's like, the suggestions you pay for the most are the ones that you don't take. And I was like, damn. Right up. He said it right in the beginning too. I was like, yo, he's coming out swinging.
Yeah. That's been a big life lesson that's become more and more apparent to me, is like what we do is important. Goes back to like the significance of all things. That includes like our conduct, our actions, and it also like dictates our future. And like what I did yesterday is affecting how I feel today, and what I do today is going to affect how I feel tomorrow. So as far as like within the 12-step world, like you go through that spiritual guide for dummies, and you're doing the moral inventory and confession, if you will, and all that, and then you you have that like exhilarating experience you're describing, then it kind of dies down a little bit. So it is like, yeah, like sustainability, or what can I do to keep this going?
Yeah, you need another one.
Yeah.
Which is why inorganic spiritual experience achieved through hallucinogens is not a good idea. You're off to the wrong start right from the get-go.
Sure.
You know? So, but I guess one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, so you kind of refer to it, I've heard it referred to as AA is like spiritual kindergarten, or 12 steps are like spiritual kindergarten, right? And you've sort of used your own words to describe the same concept. So you've graduated kindergarten now, right? You've had a spiritual awakening as the result of the 12 steps, right? But that's just a beautiful foundation now that we have to build upon, you know. And sometimes people take a long time to realize that, and they start to stagnate a little bit, and then it takes like a suggestion from somebody for them to start to like branch out and learn more, you know. I've been doing it for a while. So as far as like spiritual literature, or like just your spiritual seeking, right? All right, post 12 steps, where did you start? I'm just curious, because I'm sure you've read tons of stuff, as have I, but I'm just curious to see what was the next step from there.
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, DeMello and Tolle. Anthony DeMello was a Catholic priest in India in the 70s and 80s, and he kind of incorporated Eastern spirituality into Christianity, and then he came to the West and he basically came over and told Western Christians that they weren't doing it right. And at the expense of getting controversial, I kind of, I do consider myself a Christian, but I do have a hard time. I have a hard time enmeshing in like churches, like local churches, or Western Christianity, because unfortunately, I do think it misses the mark a little bit sometimes. And kind of what he's talking about, I mean, we mentioned like intellectualization. And DeMello was kind of saying that, you're saying your prayers, you're reading your book, your Bible, but those words, I mean, I think you said they can just be words on a piece of paper. Are you actually living it? He described like prayer and enhancement in prayer. He described prayer as like a fire. It's a fire that you have to keep going, and kind of feed it, which is pretty much what we were just talking about. So he wrote a book called Awareness. I think one of his things too, he said that we're asleep, right? So pre-spiritual awakening, human beings are walking around asleep. We're getting married in our sleep. We're getting and quitting jobs in our sleep. And he says you need to wake up. And the first step to waking up is realizing that you're asleep in the first place.
Yeah.
And I've heard different spiritual teachers say the same thing in different words. Osho, who's like that kind of crazy like guru. There's a documentary about him on Netflix. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called like Wild Wild Country.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so he's pretty controversial, but I've listened to some of his audiobooks or whatever as well, and he said you're in prison, and to get out of the prison, you have to realize that you're in a prison cell in the first place. I think he said further, you're in a prison of your own mind.
I like that analogy. I had a relapse one time, and that motherfucker of a question they always ask you after you relapse is like, what happened? I was trying to put it into words, and it's funny because I believe I used an explanation similar to that. I was just like, all of a sudden one day I just got caught in this like monotonous pattern, you know what I mean? It was just like I felt like the same day on repeat over and over again, and I very quickly just went to sleep. It was like I was sleepwalking my way through life. I think it was just I got miserable, and as I began to sleepwalk, before you know it, I just kind of sleepwalked my way right back into a drink and a drug, and so I do like that analogy, you know. Although spiritual book, that's kind of funny, but that whole concept of waking up, I mean, I think that's some good imagery there,
Sure.
But
yeah, and I guess like one essence of that experience you were having could be like kind of the come down from that initial spiritual awakening blast and exhilaration that you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah.
And I experienced that too, man. Like when I initially started having a spiritual experience, and it was really exciting and new, and everything was brand new, and then I kind of restabilized, and I stopped feeling it as much.
Yeah.
And I actually reached out to a guy who he was the reader at my home group at the time and director of operations of the company I work for, and he's a guy I looked up to, very smart man. His name is Ben. And I kind of said that to him too, like, I'm not feeling it. I'm not sure if I'm okay. Like, what's going on? And, he kind of described it as like that phase has passed, and you're kind of in a new season, and, it's time to have like a softer, subtler spiritual experience, like walk in the garden with God and just talk to him. It's not at the top of the mountaintop anymore. It's just like, you're just chilling as a spiritual being now. And the Apostle Paul actually describes that in the Bible of, having, he found God, and then he felt dry. I think he described it as like a spiritual desert, and, it freaked him out and bothered him. And he figured out like how to cope with that kind of.
Yeah. One of the first books. I mean, I think after the big book, my sponsor had me read Drop the Rock. I read both of them.
I've read most of that book, I think.
Yeah, and that's definitely a good place to go from the 12 steps, I think, because it's unfortunate that I do think like 6 and 7 are kind of skimmed over a lot. You see it a lot, like people sort of just like, oh yeah, you got to work on your character defects, and then like that's about all they have to say about it. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because you hear a lot of people say things, and I'm an advocate of therapy.
Same.
I really am, but like not everybody's in the position to be able to seek out therapy.
Costs money or insurance.
Yeah, some people can't afford it. Some people don't have health insurance, and so of course, it would be nice to tell everybody you've got to have a therapist, but it's just not practical. So I find that the really in-depth 6 and 7 work is almost like the work you would do with a therapist.
Sure.
Yeah.
So
that's definitely a good place to go if you're fresh through the steps and you're kind of like, what next? Mm-hmm. From there, I actually went to Sermon on the Mount by Emmett Fox, mm-hmm. which I was agnostic, I guess you can say. But the thing about being agnostic these days is it's kind of funny because you sort of don't believe in anything. You know what I mean? Like,
mm-hmm. It's just a world of uncertainty.
It's almost like you're afraid to believe in anything. Whereas it's like maybe at one point agnosticism was just like, oh, I'm kind of on the fence. I could go either way. Now it's just like you're just refusing to make a choice. Mm-hmm. But what was nice about the Sermon on the Mount is it sort of opened my mind to the idea of religious teachings. Like it didn't open my mind to any kind of church or anything like that, but I was very closed-minded. But I've heard some really good arguments since then that have made me kind of scratch my head a little bit. I'm like, huh.
As far as like about organized religion?
Yeah, well, just, religion in general, and I think they address some of these concerns in the big book, but like one of the things we do, and I think both of these are in the big book, so you might get a kick out of this, but one of the things we do is we say, oh, that's for weak people. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's like, it's for weak people that, like I'm strong enough, I'm smart enough that I don't need a religion to figure out what's right and what's wrong and to guide me in my life. Like, I got this.
Sure.
Right? So we condemn them for being weak, right? But then on the other side of our mouth, we say, the religious wars that they cause. You know what I mean? So it's like, okay, so they're evil and they cause wars, but they're also really weak.
Yeah.
So we're like contradicting ourselves, and it's like a logical fallacy. And so when you start to really pick apart a lot of the arguments, you start to realize, like, man, it is just like one belief is as good as the other one, maybe even better. So, but I'm still working on all that stuff. But
I think one of the benefits of religion, beyond spirituality, so let's say like organized religion, church, is spiritual discipline. There's a lot of disciplines within religions to be followed, and but that's also one of the most intimidating factors. And that, you know, it's like I feel a need for discipline in a lot of areas of my life, including spirituality.
Yeah.
And that, I think that's one thing that religion offers. It's a little, it kind of narrows the, I guess it has more specific instructions.
Yeah. Well, I've been sort of hyper focused a little bit on the big questions, like the existential questions, you know, recently.
Mm-hmm.
I've been reading a lot and you know, the atheists have two major arguments, right? One is you don't need science, right? We don't need God to explain the universe. We have science.
I have issues with that.
Well, I just think that it's like science is science is a description of the vehicle, right? Mm-hmm. Religion is like who's driving it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I don't understand using science as a religion though, which is
kind
of what you're describing.
It doesn't work.
Because what is science? Science is studying things in the world around us. It's making a hypothesis and collecting data and experimenting and, you know, coming up with a conclusion or theory based on your research to better understand things, which is great. You know, I'm not... you know, I believe in science, and I guess my question is, why can't you believe in both?
Exactly. So my to like completely counter that argument in one sentence, like everything science is explaining could simply be of divine design.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's like, and even if that's not the case, that's not really the point here. Like a scientist is explaining to you about the world that we live in. It has nothing to do with like how do you live, why are we here, like why are we here.
Right.
You can tell us all about like what here is and what we are, but it's not going to give us those big questions. So for me though, this is kind of this is the other side of the argument that you have, and this is one that you really got to chew on for a while to reckon with, you know, and that is, if there is a God and he's all good and all powerful, then why the hell is there so much evil in the world? And that's not an easy question to reckon with,
right?
And so, you know, I'm only just starting to like fully get my thoughts together on the subject, but one thing I know for sure is this: life is rough, right? That's pretty self-inherent. You know, so you can look at the evil in the world and use it as like a way to condemn the idea of God. Like, how could there be a God when there's such terrible things happening? Or you can kind of look at it from the other vantage point, right? Like, look at all the terrible things that happen in the world. How could I possibly live in this world without God?
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess for me that it brings up like, well, I think that kind of gets it makes some assumptions on what your concept of a higher power is, or how much, you know, they're in control of. I guess for me, like, you know, when you say that the bad things in the world, you know, I think we're talking about things that people do, and, you know, part of deism is, you know, we might be like God or built in God's image, but we're not. We're not God. So I guess that's, for me, it's like, I can't look at evil things that men do and assume that that's God's responsibility, or whether or not that's something he's in control of. You know, regardless of the existence or not, we have free will. Humans can do what they want to do, and I think, for me, being on a spiritual path or striving towards a higher power is trying to be a better person and make the world around me a better place as much as possible.
But I think the real problem that a lot of people have is like, where does he fit into all this free will, you know? And And I mean, I don't know. Obviously, there's so many different ideas of God and so many different paths to spirituality and so many different religions, but like, you know, the a lot of them think that God is um, perfect love, and you know what I mean. They don't necessarily look at. Well, I guess it depends. You know, if you look at the Old Testament of the Bible, like clearly that God had a mean streak in him, at least part of the time.
Yeah, within the context of the Bible, though, the New Testament and the birth, death, and resurrection of Christ kind of like reset the scoreboard between between that God and humans, between us. So Christians believe that that we're forgiven our sins because of Christ's death. So, and the reason I said why that's important is because if you take the Old Testament of the Bible out of context, you see, yes, this angry, vengeful God. But then the New Testament kind of, it can't exist independent of the other.
Well, I don't see. Here's the thing. I don't look at it as like God has evolved from the Old Testament to the New Testament. I look at it as the men perceiving the God have evolved, right? And that's how my experience has been. So maybe this is just for me, right? Mm-hmm. But I used to view that, like, I used to be that atheistic, agnostic person who looked at the world and just judged it. Like I held the world in contempt, right? Look at all this evil. Meanwhile, I'm adding to it on a daily basis, complete out of control anarchy, right? And I have the audacity to judge over everything, right? And so I looked at the world as this cruel, evil, mean place. Granted, I didn't really have much of a belief in a God at the time, but if I did, I would look at that God as like a mean, evil type of God, right? Mm-hmm. And then as I grew, and as I learned more, and as my perception changed, the world became a much different place.
Sure.
Right? Mysticism, right? Stems from mystery.
Right.
To me, that made life worth living again. Was the mystery behind it all. Because when I changed as a result of spirituality, I realized for the first time that like there was so much that I didn't know, and so much that I wanted to find out, and it just was like a mystery, and it made life exciting again.
Right.
And so that's what I see happening, right? It's just like you can view the world in two ways. There's that very realist, very pessimistic kind of way. And to put it in biblical terms, you can view it in the Old Testament light, or you can view it in the New Testament light.
Right.
And it's like it's the spirit. It's funny because it's like the stories in the Bible take a spiritual journey, just like the person that's reading them. Mm-hmm. Or at least that's how I perceive it. I mean, I'm not a Bible thumper, and I haven't even read it all the way through by any means. So,
me either. I've
dabbled. But that's something that I've really been thinking about a lot, man, because free will is a really tricky concept. And it's like, is there such thing as fate? You know what I mean? Is there predetermined things that happen in your life? Is there just checkpoints that you're definitely going to hit, but then like the road in between the checkpoints is kind of up to you to travel, Yeah. There's so many questions with that, but it's fun to ponder about.
Sure.
Whether or not you'll actually find a significant answer, I have my doubts, but
yeah. Well, you mentioned a void and a vacuum, and you just said like the more you learn, the more you realize like the less you know, kind of, and that's been my experience as well.
Well, there's a good definition for spirituality, right?
Sure.
Spirituality is a process of unlearning.
Yeah.
The less you know, the more spiritual you are.
Absolutely. Well, and part of what you were describing is like, we mentioned ego narrative. So like, oh, the world's a bad, scary, inherently evil place, and God hates us all or doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. Like that is that's a big judgment that, this is the narrative I'm painting on existence. And I think that can be, for one, your concept of a higher power is going to be influenced by your concept of yourself. So if I hate myself, I'm going to think that God hates me, and I'm probably going to think that other people hate me as well. And also like people's life experiences. I mean, yeah, people who are in poverty or growing up in terrible parts of the world or in war or stuff like that. I mean, that's going to influence their perspective on the world around them.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, I mean, there's something said to be questioning my perspective, trying to take my filter off the lens a little bit. And also, I mean, spirituality itself, or just improvement of life quality, is going to improve your perspective of the world around you too.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like the greatest spiritual teachers say the simplest stuff too. But they only need to say a very little bit because there's so many layers of meaning behind everything that they're saying.
Well, and a lot of these questions I don't know the answer to. You probably don't, we don't know. And like, I guess that's part of living a spiritual life. I mean, that was an aspect of my agnosticism as well, was being comfortable with not knowing. So I guess that's carried over into my spirituality. I don't know everything. I don't feel like I need to. And also, I mean, just to hit on that again, the more I learn, not just spiritually, like intellectually, the older I get, the more life experience I have, the more I grow as a person. The more I realize how big the world is, how small I am, how much information is out there, how many different perspectives and different cultures and perspectives in the world are, that I mean, there's a lot to learn. I could spend my life learning and still not know everything or much of anything.
Yeah. Every now and then I'll get like I get like an urge, I guess you could call it, an urge to like just identify with a certain organized religion or something like that. But then like immediately after I get that urge, it is followed by like, no, I can't do that, because I think that I think God wants me to be a free agent. And there's a poem actually and I think you might refer to it in Drop the Rock. I actually looked it up. I wish I could tell you the name of it, but I can't remember right now. But it's something along the lines of like, I stand by the door. I think that might be the name of it.
Okay.
And basically in the poem, the guy's talking about how he stands by the door to heaven, right? And so he finds this door and he sees heaven inside of it, and he like pokes his head in and he sees all the people in there and they're happy, right? And the deeper you go into heaven, the more happy you are. And he's about to just like go running right in, but then he realizes before he goes through the door that there's still a bunch of people on the other side of the door lost and suffering. And so rather than running right into it, he starts to help people like, hey, over here, here's the door, come. And all these people he's helping find the door and get through the door, right? And he goes on to say, like, some people are meant to go through the door and live on the other side, but me, I am meant to stand by the door.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of where I've been stuck a little bit, and I don't know if it's a bad thing or a good thing, you know what I mean? All I know is that like, the people that are still lost, the ones that are still suffering, like I feel like a certain level of like, that's why work with another addict or alcoholic is so effective, right? Because it's like a priest can't help us. I mean, they could help us, but they're not going to help us like another alcoholic or addict will.
I've actually heard a priest say pretty much what you're saying. I mean, I said earlier, like, I think Western Christianity kind of misses the mark sometimes, and I think it kind of speaks to what you're describing of like those who are enmeshed in that religion or in those church fellowships. I think someone who's an outsider trying to get involved can just feel kind of like alienated or just not totally welcome, and it's like the people who maybe need it the most, who need help the most, like may find it most difficult to enmesh in a fellowship like that. And I've heard a priest criticize his own church of that, like we're not reaching people well enough anymore. So there's probably some truth to that.
Yeah. Um, I I read I've been reading the Brothers Karamazov, and there's a parable that he wrote in there that I thought was really good. It was this woman dies, right? And she was terrible during her life. She was really wicked. And so she's in the lake of fire, and her guardian angel is bargaining with God, trying to get her soul into heaven. And so God's like, well, did she do anything good? Is there any reason why we might be able to let her in? And so her guardian angel like racks his brain and goes back through her entire life, and he finally finds like one single moment in her entire life where she did something good. And he says one time she gave an onion to a peasant, right? so
This sounds very Russian.
yeah, it is. Yeah, very Russian. So God says, okay, here's an onion. Use this onion to pull her out of the lake of fire. If you can pull her out of the lake of fire without the onion breaking, then she can come to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So angel's like, bet, goes down the lake of fire, holds out the onion, and so the woman grabs hold of the onion. And so he's pulling her very carefully, and she's getting closer to the edge, closer to the edge. It looks like she's about to make it out of the lake of fire. But right as she's about to make it out, all the other damned souls that are trapped in the lake of the fire start clinging to her because they want a free ride out of the lake of fire because they're suffering, And the woman, being like a cruel woman, like she lived in her life, starts kicking them and punching them and says, get off of me, it's my onion, it's my onion. And as soon as she says that, the onion breaks. Yeah.
That's interesting.
It is.
Who wrote that book? Is that Dostoevsky?
Yeah.
I mean, I think he had a religious conversion in prison in Siberia, which I guess in Crime and Punishment, when the anti-hero gets in prison, like he has that experience. Like it's supposed to be a reflection of Dostoevsky's personal experience. So he had like a some kind of Christian religious awakening in jail.
Yeah, he was Russian Orthodox, I think. But he's he's definitely a great writer, and he really pushes your buttons and stretches your mind. Like he there's another part in that book where the one brother is like a super intellectual atheist, and his logic and his reasonings for like tearing religion to shreds are like almost like you can't even like come up with like a clear answer of like how the hell you counter those arguments. And it's funny because he's a man of faith, but it's like he doesn't deny the I guess fallacies in it all. Like he doesn't deny that there's issues, you know what I mean? But instead he just sort of shows through his stories and his characters that it works regardless, So definitely worth checking out, although it is a massive book. So
yeah, I guess I have no interest in arguing with people like that, or trying to convert people or anything like that. I guess to an extent, whatever makes you happy.
Well, I like this idea like that, a lot of psychoanalysts believe that people, right, are a collection of subpersonalities, right? So there's the version of you when you're hungry, there's the version of you when you're angry, when you're sad, when you're happy, when you're excited. It's like, sure, there's more than one way to look at it, right? You could look at it as this, like, this is just you are one person, and that these are emotions that you're experiencing. Or you can look at it as like completely separate personalities that come into control of your body.
Okay.
Right? It's pretty wild. William James, right? He wrote Varieties of Spiritual Experiences, which is where the Appendix 2 in the Big Book comes from, or the quote him in the Appendix 2. It's not where it comes from, but
okay.
He had a crazy idea that so these sub personalities that exist in our mind, right? He had the idea that um, the pantheon, the Greek pantheon, like the ancient gods,
Okay.
were the archetypal sub personalities manifest in, yeah. So like, the dominant personality would be like Zeus, and then each of the other 12 Greek and Roman gods would be one aspect of the human psyche.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool concept, but I mean, I don't know if it's good for anything, but it's definitely kind of cool to think about that. But even going farther than that, what I kind of, and I almost sort of jive with this a little bit, but like there's so many major religions, on the world today, and it's like maybe there is just like sub aspects of God, and each one is sort of worshiping a different sub aspect of God, and that maybe the full picture is just so much bigger than any single one of them.
Yeah. So I guess like I'll share like my personal beliefs. So I mentioned like the Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley. Like I believe in that concept. So and I guess essentially it's saying that all the world's religions are right, and they're saying the same thing in different words with different names.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I believe. That there's inherent truth behind all of them.
Well, you're yeah. I mean, I could see that too. I think out of all the religions, I think that like there's a psychological element to Christianity because it deals with the doubt in the human heart, I think, in a way that other religions don't. And so it's really kind of geared towards that. And then like Buddhism, on the other hand, is like really geared towards the scientific aspect of the universe and stuff, because like the science and Buddhism actually stack up very well with each other.
Yeah. Yeah, Buddhism is definitely unique from all those other religions, in that the Buddha wasn't a deity, he wasn't a god, he was a man.
Yeah.
He was a prince who grew up in royalty and like indulgence, and one day he left the palace walls and saw human suffering. He saw people starving and dying in the streets, and was just like shell shocked by it, and was trying to find some well, it's kind of like we were talking about with like why are all these bad things happening in the world. I mean that's kind of what he was hit with, and he went off on this journey to find truth basically, and he tried all these different ways. He went to these spiritual teachers in India at the time, who I think were mostly either yogis or Hindus. There may be some other religion I'm forgetting that they were teaching, but it was very deity based. It was very the different gods and everything. But like the Buddha wasn't, I don't know, it just wasn't working for him. And then he became an ascetist, which is like, I don't know if you're familiar with ascetism. It's like sacrificing self-pleasure.
Okay, yeah.
He did it to the point of like starving himself. He stopped eating and thought he would have like some spiritual awakening if he went without food and without all these different things. And just became him at his most basic core. And that didn't work either. And he was sitting under the Bodhi tree in India, and a villager came along and gave him some rice or something. And he's like, you know what, I'm going to eat. And I think it was at that time where he did have his spiritual awakening and experienced nirvana. And they say like Bodhi flowers were falling, or lilies or something were falling through the sky. And
yeah, I think towards the end is when I start to sort of get more familiar with the story. But sure. I remember there's some sort of evil deity that comes and tries to distract him. Like they march like a whole army up, and he doesn't break his concentration. And
oh, okay.
Yeah,
there's a lot of like parables and stuff.
Yeah,
and like Buddhist transcripts. And honestly, man, my personal belief is most of those things in like spiritual texts are metaphorical.
Absolutely.
And I think back to Christianity, that's an issue that people, well, that's that story makes no sense or whatever. Well, it's not a story, it's a parable. Like it's a you're supposed to learn something. There's a spiritual truth behind the story. Like, and once again it goes back to like maybe Western Christians missing the mark a little bit. Like I've gone to an Easter service at a Baptist church where it was like I don't know, man. It was like, you need to believe that Jesus physically, talking about the resurrection and just the physical act of him getting up out of the grave and walking away. And like, I'm like, well, maybe it's symbolic rebirth and that his spirit lived on beyond his physical body or something.
Yeah. Or and honestly, at the very least, like, even if it's something that actually happened, like, at this point in time, it doesn't matter so much in the sense of like, what is the metaphor behind it that applies to life today, right? Because like, we're not. It doesn't matter how spiritual you are, you're not going to rise from the dead. You know what I mean? Right. So it's like, what does that mean abstractly, where it's like applicable to life today? And I think that's like another important thing and that's what I love about 12 steps. You know what I mean? And I think that is why it's such an effective program, is because it's not just like abstract concepts. You know what I mean? It's like practical.
Right.
Like, all right, this is, obviously there's some philosophy in there, but it's like, for the most part, it's like, this is how we act. This is what we do. You know what I mean? And it's like, that is easy to get behind. And the best part about it is like, you don't need the faith to act, right? Matter of fact,
you just do it.
You just do it, and then the faith comes as a result of that.
Yeah.
And I think that's how it's got to work. You know what I mean? Because it's otherwise, like, if faith was the price of admission, I know I wouldn't be sitting here right now. Because I just didn't have it, and I wouldn't have been able to find it in the state that I was in.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I found faith in a higher power from feeling an experience through spiritual guidance.
So if you, I guess in closing, like, if there was like one piece of advice that you could give somebody that was struggling with the concept of spirituality, what would you say to that person?
Well, I guess generally speaking, I would just emphasize that my interest in spirituality, and the only reason really I'm a proponent of it, is because in my experience, and I believe that it relieves human suffering. I mean, I think it can help us live a better life, be happier, a more fulfilled life. So, and I do believe that's accessible to anyone. I mean, just to back it up, like I said, I mean, to a degree, whatever makes you happy, man, like, it's cool with me. If you're an atheist and you're happy with that, and that's, you're living a rich, fulfilling, happy life in your atheism, then that's cool.
Yeah.
But, for people who are craving spirituality or they're just going through it in general, I think, I mean, you mentioned therapy. There's a lot of other different resources available and things that I utilize in my personal life and with my mental health and addiction recovery.
Yeah.
And spirituality is just one facet of those things. I kind of look at it as I have, these bubbles around me to utilize, including, therapy and friends and hobbies and exercise and diet. And, spirituality is just like a unique thing that I think just heals in a unique way and can enrich your life in a unique way.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just reminded, do you ever see that video? It says, forget everything you know about addiction. And then they talk about the rat park.
No.
The guy got like rats addicted to cocaine, and they like basically did cocaine until they killed themselves, and then they built like this beautiful rat park where they could hang out with all the other rats and play, and then all of a sudden they stopped doing the cocaine.
Okay.
And so the whole point of this video is just like, this is how we treat addiction, is connection. You know what I mean? And I'm like, that is part of it. Like, right. He's sort of onto something, but he's missing a giant piece of it, right? You want to know why? Because people aren't fucking rats.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Rats aren't self-conscious, and rats don't suffer from something called self-centered fear, right? And so it's like, yes, human connection is at the very core of like what I think brings about the healing process when it comes to recovery, right? But we have an inability to connect, right? Because we are blocked by our own fears. And so, yes, we need connection, but like, how do we overcome the fear? That's the question we need to be asking ourselves. And I think without spirituality, you'd be hard pressed to find a way to do that successfully, at least on a regular basis, right? because without faith in something, it doesn't matter what it is, without faith in something that this is where we are supposed to be, everything happens for a reason, and we are where we are supposed to be right here and now. Like, how do you start to overcome all the fear? Because there's plenty of reasons to be afraid.
Sure.
You know what I mean? You could try to like whistle in the dark like a scared child to keep your spirits up. You know, I tried doing that for a while, but that doesn't work long term, you know. And so faith is the only way that I have found to consistently overcome that self-centered fear. And a result of that is the human connection that, you know, stop the rats from doing the old cocaine.
Sure.
But yeah, thank you for sitting down with me. I think that was a really good talk. I'm sure I'll get a lot of feedback on this one because we kind of covered a lot of material here, and everybody has varying opinions on a lot of this stuff. So I hope that I think there might be a link in the description of the to send voice messages if any of you guys want to give your opinions. But in the meantime, look out for the next episode sometime next week, and I will see you guys next time.